Simon & Schuster Audioworks presents Star Trek: Yesterday's Sun by A.C. Crispin. This program is read by James Doohan, with Leonard Nimoy as the voice of Spock.
I'm alone in my quarters, staring at an image on my computer screen. I will myself to remain calm. I'm a Vulcan. I will remain calm. There must be some other logical explanation for what I am seeing. There must be. But even as I attempt to convince myself, I know that there is only one possible explanation. I order the computer to magnify the first of the two images taken from the archaeological records of the now-destroyed planet named Sarpedon. The first cave painting depicts a hunting scene. Two spear-carrying figures, biped, humanoid, face two huge creatures. They vaguely remind me of the Selats on my native Vulcan. But there is nothing friendly about these animals with their monstrous tusks, razor-like claws, and small, reddish eyes. They tower over the primitive hunters. The color of that rock wall, gray, with reddish highlights. I remember lying on the fur-covered bed, looking past the curve of her shoulder, golden in the firelight, and seeing that identical wall. No one had yet painted pictures on it, but it is the same. That is Zarabeth's cave. I close my eyes for a moment, then order the computer to display the second of the two paintings, the image of a face. Glowing, ghostly white against the dark gray stone of the cave wall, it seems to float before my eyes. The eyes, light-colored, wide, not like mine, not at all. But the brows, black and slanting, the cheekbones, high and angular, the nose, strong and high-bridged. Barring the age difference, they are the same as my own. The style of the painting is primitive and arresting, and all of the youngster's features are executed with meticulous care, including the ears. Leonard McCoy knows too, I think. He had been with me when the young ensign had brought us the computer-generated photos from the ATOS library. When she asked whether there had been any Vulcan colonization in that sector of space some 5,000 years ago, I saw the shock in his blue eyes. After all, he had been with me then, too, when we were inadvertently transported back to Ice Age Sarpedon. He was there when I was forced to leave Zarabeth behind. McCoy has not forgotten, any more than I have. It has been 2 years since Starfleet dispatched the Enterprise to alert the people of Sarpedon that their sun, the red giant star Beta Niobe, was about to nova. The warning had proved unnecessary. The inhabitants of the doomed world had already taken refuge in their planet's past. Due to an accident, McCoy and I were also thrust back through time into the planet's last ice age. There we met Zarabeth, a woman who had been wrongfully exiled to that time and condemned to live out her life alone there. It would have been fatal for us to remain, and equally deadly for Zarabeth to return with us to the present. During the past 2 years, I'd thought very little about the woman I'd encountered in that frozen land. Indeed, I had tried not to think of Zarabeth at all. But occasionally, just as my mind hovered on the edge of sleep, the memory of her returned. Her soft, brownish gold hair, her sweet, rounded features, her smile. But she was not smiling when I had to leave her. There was such desperate loneliness in her eyes as she stood clutching her fur cloak around her slender body against the icy lash of the blizzard. As I sit in the solitude of my cabin, I know I must begin considering precisely what I should do about the face on the wall of the cave.
James Kirk was on his way to the bridge when he spotted his chief surgeon ahead of him in the corridor. In a few swift strides, the captain caught up with McCoy. Kirk gave the doctor a meaningful glance. Haven't seen you around much lately, Bones. Anything interesting going on? The doctor did not meet his eyes. Interesting, Jim? You know what I mean, Bones. What's up? The doctor hesitated. Do you remember a world named Sarpedon? Of course I do. The captain wrinkled his nose. It took me weeks to forget the smell of that medieval jail after that crazy old Mr. Atos shoved me back through that time portal. What about it? Again, the doctor evaded the captain's question. Did Spock ever talk to you about what happened to us in that ice age? No, as I recall, both of you were pretty quiet about it. Kirk frowned thoughtfully. Didn't a woman save your lives back there? Zarabeth. That was her name. McCoy nodded. You seen Spock lately? No, he's been off duty. Bones, exactly what the hell is going on? The doctor shook his head. Nothing I can talk about, Jim. See you later. Leonard McCoy might not care to admit it, but he shared a certain kinship with Spock. If he didn't want to talk, he couldn't be persuaded. Kirk was strongly tempted to order his first officer to tell him what was wrong. But the captain chose instead to bide his time, sure that the Vulcan would come to him eventually. His patience was rewarded the following afternoon when the door signal to his cabin flashed. I've been expecting you, Mr. Spock. Would you care for some Saurian brandy? The Vulcan sat down reluctantly and shook his head at the offer of a drink. Want to tell me what's going on? Spock looked away, not meeting Kirk's eyes. I must request leave for an indeterminate amount of time. It concerns a family matter. Is someone ill? Anything I can do? No. My family is well. The captain took a slow sip of his brandy, studying his friend. The Vulcan looked tired. There were new lines around his eyes, and he was plainly troubled. Kirk listened intently, waiting for Spock's next words, and was suddenly conscious of something subliminal seeping into his mind, touching. And for a moment, he was feeling deep resolution mixed with guilt and shame. He held his breath, trying to look inward, to focus. And the contact, if contact it was, and not his imagination, was gone. Spock was staring at him. Jim, you aren't telepathic, I know, but for a moment I sensed. Kirk nodded. I know. I felt it too for a moment. I know you're extremely concerned as well as determined to go. Now, what's going on? Spock shook his head. This problem is my responsibility. Please don't ask me to explain further. Kirk leaned forward, holding the Vulcan's eyes with his own. You won't tell me the truth, because this mission of yours is dangerous, right? Spock's mouth tightened, and he glanced away. Kirk nodded. I knew it. You'll need help. I'm coming with you. No, Captain. Kirk drummed his fingers angrily on the arm of his chair, wondering where in hell Spock was going. Obviously, McCoy knew more than he was telling. Sarpedon? Kirk wondered. But that planet doesn't exist in the present. It was destroyed, and all its inhabitants escaped into the past. For the past 5,000 years in the past, Zarabeth, and the face on the wall of the cave. Cave? Face? Kirk straightened in his seat, his eyes widening. The image in his mind was clear. A Vulcan face painted on the rocky wall of a cave. Nothing he'd ever seen before. I got it that time, Spock. Call it telepathy or just insight. I know now. This has to do with biology, doesn't it? Mutely, Spock nodded. The Vulcan's face was drawn and pale, and his dark eyes were haunted. Kirk stared at his first officer in shock. It's incredible. 5,000 years ago in that frozen hell... Spock nodded grimly. Zarabeth bore my child. Are you sure, Spock? Maybe there's some mistake. The Vulcan shook his head, his eyes bleak. I am sure, Jim. Spock stared at his captain calmly. I am going back to get him. But, how? I must journey to Vulcan. There I will ask T'Pau to request permission of the Federation Security Council to allow me to use the Guardian of Forever. I will use it to return to Sarpedon's past. It is my duty. Kirk took a deep breath. I hate to add to your problems, but I'm still insisting on coming with you, Spock. When the Vulcan began to protest, the captain shook his head warningly. If I don't go, you don't get leave. You'll have to go AWOL to get off the Enterprise without me. It's as simple as that. That is tantamount to blackmail, Jim. Not tantamount. It is blackmail, Spock. We can divert to Andros, and you can catch a transport for Vulcan from there. I'll be ready and waiting for you when you get back. Good thing we'll both be able to take shore leave. Spock opened his mouth to protest further. The captain stared at his first officer. What are you still sitting there for? Move it, mister. The Vulcan responded to the snap of that order so automatically that he was standing outside Kirk's door in the corridor before he realized what had happened. James T. Kirk received the message that T'Pau's request had been approved by the Federation Council on the day the Enterprise docked at Starbase 2. 2 days later, Spock himself returned. The two officers quickly changed into durable scouting coveralls and, carrying the packs Kirk had assembled, headed back for the transporter room. When they reached the turbolift, Kirk announced their destination. The lift's doors snapped shut and then opened again. They heard a warning signal. Who the hell pushed the override? Kirk began thumbing buttons and the lift's doors began closing again. Jim, Spock, wait! They heard running footsteps, and then Leonard McCoy dived into the turbolift. Phew, I thought I was going to miss you. Kirk eyed the doctor's scouting coveralls and pack. Bones, don't argue with me, Jim. You didn't really think I was going to let you two go without me, did you? Bones, you're getting off this lift. That's an order. The hell I will. I'm on leave, just like you. And Ice Age Sarpedon ought to be beautiful this time of year. The captain blinked, surprised. Sarpedon? How did you know, Bones? McCoy gave Kirk a disgusted glance. I was there, Jim, on Sarpedon. And then last week when Ensign McNair showed us the pictures. Doesn't take a Vulcan to figure out that this was a case where 1 + 1 = 3. Besides, he held up a hypo, I figured out how to reverse the conditioning that kept Zarabeth exiled to the past. You want it? I go with it. Kirk scowled and reached for the injector. Give it to me, Bones. You can't go with us. This is going to be dangerous. Besides, T'Pau only specified clearance for 2. Right, Spock? Kirk's hopes were dashed when his first officer shook his head. No, Captain. I requested clearance for 3. Taking into account Dr. McCoy's predictable penchant for rushing in where angels fear to tread, I reasoned that he would attempt this. Only the Vulcan's eyes betrayed his amusement. There is usually a logical pattern to the good doctor's illogical behavior. Leonard McCoy's jaw dropped. Why, you pointy-eared ungrateful... The doctor was still sputtering seconds later when the 3 officers reached the transporter chamber. Okay, Bones, you win. Kirk waved the medical officer up onto one of the transporter pads. Next stop, Gateway, and the Guardian of Forever. planet hasn't changed, James Kirk thought, looking around him at the desolation that was Gateway. The same silvery sky, shading to black overhead, pockmarked with stars. The same ruins, the same aura of terrible age and eternal loneliness. The same cold wind, whining like a lost spirit. Despite his insulated clothing, Kirk shivered as he watched Spock analyze data from Sarpedon's past on his tricorder. The three officers had arrived on Gateway nearly an hour ago. They'd been met by Dr. Barbara Vargas, a short, stocky woman with cropped gray hair. Vargas was the leader of the 12-person archaeological expedition assigned to study the Guardian of Forever. The huge wheel-shaped time portal was capable of showing the entire history of a world in its central opening. Anyone foolhardy enough to leap through was instantly transported back to whatever time and world the ancient time entity happened to be projecting. The Enterprise had discovered the time portal several years ago, and the Guardian had informed them that, since before your sun burned hot in space, it had been alone, awaiting a question. The captain glanced over at Spock's drawn face, worried. He knew that his friend was still deeply troubled and ashamed of the emotional lapse that had led to the Vulcan's involvement with Zarabeth. Kirk cleared his throat uneasily. Spock, how long before you finish your calculations telling us when to jump? The Vulcan did not look up from the screen of his tricorder. I am finished now. I believe I have managed to isolate the correct period during Sarpedon's last ice age. Our problem will not be when to jump, but where we shall end up on Sarpedon's surface. We cannot search the entire planet. The captain frowned. I never thought of that. What should we do? Spock stared over at the huge stone shape. The Guardian possesses powers we can barely begin to comprehend. If I can communicate our wishes to it, it may be able to transport us not only to the proper time, but to the correct location. I shall attempt it. The Vulcan walked over to stand before the time portal, then solemnly saluted it. Guardian, greetings. I am Spock of Vulcan, and I have traveled with you once before. Do you remember me?
I forget nothing. Greetings, Spock of Vulcan.
Guardian, are you able to differentiate between one life form and another? For instance, can you discern that I am of a different species than my two companions?
You are of a different species within yourself, Spock of Vulcan.
Kirk wondered whether that response was affirmative or not. But Spock was already continuing. Very well. I wish to locate a life form living in the northern hemisphere on the planet Sarpedon 5,000 years ago. He resembles me strongly. We are of one blood and kin. Is it possible for you to place us in proximity to him when we leap through your central opening? The ancient voice boomed out again after a moment's hesitation.
All things are possible, Spock of Vulcan. As you yourself are fond of saying, there are always possibilities.
Stony-faced, Spock picked up his pack and beckoned to his companions. The three officers huddled together, muscles twitching in anticipation as they waited. Spock completed one final check on his tricorder. On my count of three, then. He turned back to the time portal. Guardian, I request to see the history of Sarpedon. Even the incessant wind seemed hushed for a moment, as the middle of the time portal filled with vapor, then swirling images too fast for the eye to catch and remember. Be ready soon. The Vulcan's eyes never left his tricorder. 1, 2, 3. Now! As one man, the three officers took a giant stride, heading straight into the heart of that whirling vortex. James Kirk glimpsed a star-flecked blackness. Then something that seemed to be a negative image of that same scene. He staggered forward, dizzy and blinking. Cold air blasted his face, making his eyes water in the vicious, icy wind. Spock grasped his captain's shoulder with steely fingers. "This way, Jim. Out of the wind." Kirk stumbled after the Vulcan, dragging McCoy. The officers hastily pitched the small thermal tent they had brought, then crawled in. Inside the tent, Kirk looked at his companions in amusement as they crouched in the dimness, thinking that they all looked like monstrous insects with their face shields on. The mask had faceted eye coverings, and their shiny fabric protected the wearer's face completely. Dr. McCoy pulled off his mask, brushing snow out of his hair. "I gotta hand it to you, Spock. What a great place to spend our leave. Beautiful warm sunlight, soft breezes. The natives are The doctor gulped. "What was that?" Kirk grinned. "Probably a Seathar, Bones. A huge, very savage predator. Their favorite meal is chief surgeons, who don't have the sense to follow orders given by their commanding officers." It was a long time before the three officers slept. Kirk awakened the next morning to find Spock gone. He dressed hastily and crawled out of the tent. Seeing Spock standing a few meters away, tricorder in hand, he joined him. Together, they looked out at the landscape. The storm had gone, and the air was cold and clear. Beta Niobe was rising, swollen and red, in a pale lavender sky. "Spock, do you remember anything about this place from when you were here before? Landmarks? Distances?" The Vulcan sighed. "Captain, we were in the middle of a blizzard without protective clothing." McCoy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Wait a minute. I remember something that might help, Jim. There was a hot spring in Zarabeth's cave because it was warm in there." Dr. McCoy is correct. We should therefore search for signs of that spring along the cliffs. Mineral deposits, for example. Well, we better get started, gentlemen. It was the following afternoon when Dr. McCoy found the hot spring. Steam rose out of it, and the rock itself was encrusted with mineral deposits in bright reds, blues, greens, and yellows. The Vulcan's eyes were fixed on his tricorder. "I am picking up something, a life form, sentient, not an animal." Dr. McCoy frowned. "I have the strangest feeling I have to get away from here." "So do I," Kirk agreed. "Spock, what about you? Spock? Spock, are you all right?" Confused, the first officer shook his head as alien emotions flooded his mind. Fear, hate, anger. He gasped and swayed, putting both hands to his temples. Realizing that the emotions were being projected into his mind, he summoned all his Vulcan mental disciplines to fight back, resist the mental invasion. The mind rules. My mind rules. My mind rules. The other's mental projection was strong, but Spock was determined. And after a few seconds, the Vulcan looked up, his mind his own again. Ahead of him, he glimpsed a dark figure darting between two giant boulders. Shaking off McCoy and Kirk, Spock began running. He could hear the others racing after him. The cloaked stranger increased speed, and the Vulcan summoned all his reserves, putting on a burst of speed, and finally he was gaining on his quarry. Spock had nearly reached the cave opening when a rock caught him in the shoulder. He staggered, nearly fell, then ducked behind an outcropping as another stone whizzed by his head. Kirk and McCoy reached him, panting hard, and all three stared at the being crouched near the dark mouth of Zarabeth's cave. It was humanoid, but so swathed in furs that it was impossible to see more. Spock edged around the outcrop of rock. The fugitive snarled with fear and rage. The sound was more animal than human. A chunk of rock caught the surgeon in his midsection, and McCoy doubled over. Kirk leaped toward the fugitive, saw the flash of sunlight on the blade of a knife, and lashed out with his foot, sending the weapon flying. Moving with the speed of desperation, the ragged figure flung itself on him, grabbing the captain by the throat. Kirk went over onto his back near the cave opening, struggling desperately to get away. His assailant's steely fingers tightened. Kirk chopped hard at the furred shape, then yelped as teeth sank into his wrist. He kicked out viciously. Suddenly, the stranger sagged half on top of him, limp. Spock released his fingers from their grasp on the fugitive's neck and shoulder, and the captain rolled free and sat up, rubbing his neck. Leonard McCoy staggered toward them, medical tricorder in hand. The doctor ran his scanner over the unconscious mound of skin and furs. He's all right. Just out cold. Help me turn him over, Jim. Kirk and McCoy gently rolled the stranger over. His concealing hood fell back, revealing a bearded face with long dark hair tied back by a leather thong. It was, unmistakably, the same face as the one they'd seen painted on the cave wall, but considerably older. This man was in his mid to late 20s. The doctor sat back on his heels, studying the stranger's features. Then he shook his head and glanced up at the Vulcan, who was staring down at the young man in silent shock. "Looks like you miscalculated a bit, Spock. But better late than never, right?" By the time Kirk and McCoy had carried the young man into the cave and laid him down on the bed of furs, he was beginning to stir slightly. The captain winced as McCoy swabbed the blood off his wrist. "Ouch! God, he fights like a wildcat." Leonard McCoy glanced down at his patient. "I think I know what the problem is. Our face shields." He pulled his off. "Well, if you didn't know what they were, they looked pretty scary. The poor kid thought we were bug-eyed monsters." The captain smiled reassuringly. "Hello there. I'm sorry if we scared you. You must be Zarabeth's son." The young man sat up unsteadily, rubbing his neck. "Yes, I am Zarabeth's son. My name is Zar. How do you know who I am? Were you looking for me? Who are you?" Kirk chuckled. "Well, one question at a time." Quickly, he introduced himself and Dr. McCoy, then hesitated, waiting for the Vulcan to step forward and identify himself. But Spock made no move. Finally, Kirk continued. "And the gentleman standing over there is my first officer, Commander Spock." Zar's eyes widened incredulously. "Spock, a Vulcan? First officer of the Enterprise?" Zar's eyes held the Vulcan's. "My father?" Spock nodded expressionlessly. "Yes." Zar's teeth suddenly flashed in a wide grin, a smile so joyful that it was contagious. Kirk found himself grinning too. "But how did you get here? My mother told me many times about the two men who came from the future, but she said that the world was going to be destroyed when the sun exploded. The Atavachron must have gone with it." "We used a different time portal. Spock explained briefly about the Guardian of Forever, then glanced around the cave tensely. "But where is Zarabeth?" "She is dead, Father." Remembered pain touched the younger man's eyes. "Killed 7 summers ago when she fell into a crevasse on the ice." Even though the Vulcan did not move, Kirk had the distinct impression that he'd winced when his son addressed him as Father. He wished he could warn the young man not to push it. The Vulcan nodded. "I am sorry to hear that." McCoy eyed the younger man curiously. 7 years is a long time to be alone. "How old are you, son?" "I have 25 summers. Soon it will be 26. Kirk looked over at the entrance to the cave where shadows were lengthening. "It's getting late. We ought to get back to Gateway soon." Zar gave them a disappointed glance. "Oh, well, I understand. I only wish that I could see your time," he sighed. "Many nights I've sat watching the stars, wishing that I, too, could travel among them." Zar hesitated, then smiled wistfully. "I think it's in my blood, this wanting." Dr. McCoy fastened the strap on his pack. "When we leave, son, you're coming back with us. That's why we made this trip." Obviously startled, the young man turned to Spock. When the Vulcan nodded confirmation, Zar's eyes flashed excitedly. "I'm going to see the starship? All the wonders my mother told me about?" Spock nodded silently. Zar picked up his fur cloak, his eyes returning to Spock's face wonderingly. "All my life, I dreamed that someday you would come and take me to live with you aboard the starship. I can hardly believe that I'm not dreaming now, Father." Spock stiffened visibly and glanced away. "I would prefer that you address me by my name. I find the appellation Father inappropriate when used by a stranger." Kirk groaned inwardly as he watched all the animation vanish from Zar's features. The younger man's stony expression now mirrored Spock so exactly that it was uncanny. "As you wish, sir." Zar deliberately turned his back on Spock. "I'll get my things." Kirk caught McCoy's eye just in time to prevent the doctor from launching into an indignant tirade. The captain shook his head slightly, mouthed, "Not now, Bones," and jerked his head at the cave entrance. "McCoy and I will wait outside for you, Spock."
Inside the cave, I stand alone, staring at Zar's paintings, their colors fresh and still vivid. I should not have called him stranger, I think, as I remember the pain in the young man's eyes. I should have found another way to request that he call me by name. But this entire situation is so implausible. I am not old enough to have offspring 25 summers old. To see my own features mirrored like that is extremely disquieting. Due to our ages, no one is likely to suspect the truth of our relationship. But still, my gaze travels around the rocky chamber, and I see several haunches of meat hanging in the corner. My stomach tightens, and I must remind myself that my reaction is illogical. Of course Zar eats meat. Here, in this climate, there is little vegetation to consume, and Zarabeth's supplies must have been exhausted long ago. Zarabeth is dead. With part of my mind, I am glad I will not have to see her again. I am not the person she thought she knew. And yet, I feel genuine sorrow and regret at the thought that she is gone. My eyes fall on the bedplace, spread with furs, and I experience a sudden, vivid memory of her. Her mouth beneath mine, her silken skin against my own. The soft little cries she made as I angrily forced the images out of my mind. But it happened. One corner of my mind whispers mockingly, "It happened." And denying that it happened is illogical. The proof that it happened is in the next chamber, hurt and angry because I called him stranger. The proof is tall and has gray eyes and my own features beneath that beard. I hear soft footsteps and turn to see Tsar emerge from the adjoining chamber, his face an expressionless mask. Only his eyes betray his hurt and anger. I'm sorry, I think, but I cannot say the words aloud. I beckon silently, and my son follows me out of the cave, away from the only home he has ever known.
From the first moment he set foot on the deck of the Enterprise, Tsar fell in love with the huge starship. Captain Kirk, recognizing a kindred emotion, let him indulge his passion. Spock's Vulcan relative, as he was known, the first officer never explained to anyone exactly how he and Tsar were related, was given the run of the ship, and the crew of the Enterprise responded to his interest by informally adopting him. Most of the time, Tsar enjoyed being with others, but there were times when he found himself longing for the solitude of his subarctic wastes. Part of the problem was that the person Tsar longed most to actually talk to have as a friend, and more than a friend, remained elusive and remote. Of course, the young man thought, I must prove myself, earn his regard, even as my mother did. Then he will care for me as he did for her. Determined to impress his father, Tsar threw himself into his studies and made rapid progress. But the hoped-for change in Spock's attitude did not develop. The first officer assigned him lessons and taught him to speak the Vulcan language, but that was all. There was no sharing, no closeness. During their first days together, Tsar tried several times to initiate personal conversations, in the hopes that his father's cool reserve would thaw, but he soon stopped. It was too painful to be continually rebuffed. But soon after the Enterprise embarked on her next mission, Spock began coaching his son in ancient Vulcan mind-melding techniques, and Tsar gained new hope that this might be a way the two of them could actually communicate. It was a well-established fact that Vulcans possessed telepathy of a limited sort. Spock could mind-meld with other beings, linking his mind to theirs by physically touching them. His son also had this ability, but to a far greater extent than the first officer. Tsar could pick up thoughts just by concentrating, even when he was sitting across the room from the other person, or across a poker table, as Dr. McCoy ruefully discovered. However, in addition to his telepathy, Tsar possessed another quite different ability. He was an empath, able to sense the emotions of others even from a considerable distance. He could also project his own feelings into another's mind, as he had tried to do with his own terror of the 3 bug-eyed monsters that day near the cave. Tsar called what he'd attempted feeling fear, and explained to McCoy that once, when he'd been attacked by a crazed Seathar, he managed to project his own fear of death into the creature's mind so strongly that the animal's heart stopped. But the toll that effort had taken on him had nearly cost the young man his own life. As the weeks passed, though, Tsar's hopes were dashed yet again. During their lessons in controlling and mastering Tsar's innate esper abilities, Spock was always careful to keep his own telepathic barriers in place, holding his son at a mental arm's length. The Vulcan only linked his mind peripherally with the younger man's. He never mind-melded with him. As Tsar grew proficient in the age-old Vulcan mental techniques and disciplines, he began to realize how little of his father's inner thoughts Spock was sharing. Then one day, Tsar had an idea. If we cannot speak aloud, the young man reasoned, then perhaps we can share thoughts. Tsar resolved that during their next lesson, he would attempt a full mind meld. 2 days later, Spock summoned Tsar to his quarters for a telepathic teaching session. The first officer began by demonstrating the ancient Vulcan Vedra Pra techniques. Suddenly, Spock felt his son drop his mental shield. Hastily, the Vulcan clamped his own telepathic barrier down tightly, tacitly rejecting the deeper communication Tsar was offering. But before Spock could break away, Tsar tried clumsily to establish a full mind meld. Though unskilled, the raw power of his young consciousness battered at the Vulcan in a barrage of confused, non-verbal thoughts and emotions. Spock felt his own mental shield buckling in the face of that intangible onslaught, and for a brief second, Tsar's entire mind touched his own, jolting like a charge of electricity, hurting the first officer on an emotional as well as a mental level. For the space of a heartbeat, the two were one, and there was pain. Only pain. Spock shook his head, fighting free of the pressure of Tsar's fingers, even as they voluntarily slackened. The Vulcan stumbled back a pace and stood, swaying a little, trying to regain his mental and emotional balance. He drew a deep, shaky breath. His son's face was ashen. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I was only trying to..." Spock struggled to control his anger and pain. "On Vulcan, what you attempted just now is regarded as a heinous crime. Forcing a meld is an unforgivable intrusion of the spirit. You must never do so again. Do you understand?" Tsar nodded. "Yes, sir, I acted on impulse. It was wrong. I know better now. I won't ever forget." The pain was ebbing away from Spock's mind now, leaving only an agonizing throbbing behind his temples. The Vulcan nodded curtly. "See that you do not, or I will be unable to continue training you." His son bristled. "I suppose you could call it training, as though I were some stray animal you'd rescued, but I think it's closer to the programming you do to your computers." He bit his lip, struggling to control himself, then half extended his hand. "I can't touch you! Why?" Something within him wanted to respond to his son's anguished plea. He stared at Tsar, on the verge of speaking, but the ingrained reserve of years held. Quickly, before he could change his mind, Spock turned on his heel and stalked out of his quarters. That night, after their customary self-defense workout in the Enterprise's gym, Tsar hesitantly asked James Kirk whether he might speak with him privately. Surprised, the captain took him to his quarters and waved the young man to a seat. "What did you want to see me about, Tsar?" The young man hesitated. His face was closed and impassive, and only the tightness of his jaw muscles betrayed his agitation. Kirk experienced a flash of déjà vu. Sometimes, he thought, Tsar's so much like Spock that it's uncanny, and yet they're so different in so many ways. With an abrupt gesture, Tsar straightened, his face pale and drawn. "Why doesn't my father like me?" James Kirk sighed, realizing that he'd been expecting something like this. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean." Tsar's eyes never left the captain's face. "I've studied. Doc says that I learn faster than anyone he's ever known. I've behaved as though I were really Vulcan, the way everyone aboard thinks I am. No meat, no outward show of what I'm feeling, but it doesn't do any good." The young man took a deep breath. "My mother told me that when she first met him, he was cold and aloof, but that later he grew gentle and loving. I hoped that it would be the same for me, but..." His mouth tightened. "She always told me that if my father could see me, he'd be proud of me. Kirk sighed again. Well, I'm going to tell you the truth, Tsar. When he went back in time using the Atavachron, it changed Spock. Changed? Tsar frowned, puzzled. Kirk nodded. While he was with your mother, your father behaved the way Vulcans did long ago, before they substituted logic for emotion. He told me. He even ate meat. Kirk gazed directly at Tsar, and he experienced strong feelings, needs. Do you understand what I mean? The younger man's gray eyes were wide with shocked realization. And while he was like that, he took my mother? It was a statement, not a question. But Kirk nodded. Tsar paused, then swallowed painfully. Poor Zarabeth. All her life she lived on the memory of a dream, never realizing that he used her. He glanced away, no longer meeting Kirk's eyes. He never gave a damn about her. Kirk raised a hand in protest. I don't know the truth about his feelings for her, and you don't either. Only Spock knows, and he'll probably never discuss it, because he's a very private person. Tsar's mouth tightened bitterly. So many things are clear now. He only came back for me because he felt that it was his duty. He never wanted me. Kirk shook his head. You're not being fair, Tsar. He does care. He risked his life to find you. What's more, he allowed Bones and me to risk our lives, too. Never forget that. The younger man refused to meet his eyes. So many things are clear now. I'm an embarrassment to him. No wonder he doesn't want anyone to know I'm his son. No wonder he's never mentioned taking me to Vulcan to meet my grandparents. He's ashamed of me. Ashamed of my very existence. I've been studying Vulcan customs. They're rigid and strict. And on Vulcan, they call offspring like me Kranath. Do you know what that word means? Kirk stared at the young man, trying to think of a way to break through the wall of hurt anger. No, I don't know what it means. Tsar stood up. It means shamed ones. You humans also have a word. Bastard. While Kirk was still searching for something, anything to say, his visitor nodded gravely. Thanks for saving me from making a worse fool of myself. Wait! His back stiff with fury, Tsar ignored the captain and strode out. The following evening, James Kirk received a visit from his chief surgeon. McCoy looked grim. Now what, the captain wondered. The doctor didn't mince words. Jim, I'm worried about Tsar and Spock. The doctor made a frustrated gesture. Things weren't going good between them before, but they're 100 times worse now. The captain sighed. Damn it, Bones. I didn't mean to make trouble. I thought it might help Tsar to be more understanding. So I told him the truth last night about what happened to Spock went through the Atavachron. Loudly. Leonard McCoy shook his head. Should have guessed. Hell. You said it. Bones, this can't go on. I've kept quiet about Tsar being aboard, knowing that he needed a chance to adjust somewhat to modern society, but I can't risk letting this relationship affect Spock's efficiency as a Starfleet officer. I'd better suggest that he ship Tsar home to Sarek and Amanda on Vulcan. The doctor stood and began pacing restlessly around Kirk's cabin. Spock's not ready for that, Jim. He's still having trouble accepting the situation himself. Can you picture him telling Sarek about all this? James Kirk shook his head, his hazel eyes troubled. No, I can't, Bones, but I can't risk... He broke off as his intercom signaled. Kirk here. Lieutenant Uhura's voice emerged. Sir, I have a priority 1 message for you. Kirk frowned. Decode and patch it through to me here, Lieutenant. Moments later, the captain was scanning the message. Leonard McCoy heard him curse under his breath. "What's going on, Jim?"
This is from Commodore Robert Wesley aboard the Lexington. His ship is currently assigned the duty of patrolling Sector 90.4. That's Gateway and the Guardian Bones. Bob reports that he's just picked up 2 Romulan vessels on his ship's sensors, but then they engaged their cloaking devices and vanished.
"Oh, no. Romulans near the Guardian."
Kirk paced uneasily as he thought aloud.
"That's right.
Of course, Bob Wesley doesn't know exactly why the Federation regards Gateway as so vital. The Guardian is classified top secret. But Bob knows that Starfleet can't risk allowing enemy forces access to Gateway, so he's calling for help."
"Romulan ships crossing the neutral zone. That constitutes a total breach of our treaty with them. It's an act of war, Jim."
Kirk scowled down at the message. "We're the closest Starfleet vessel, and we're the only people who know that the Guardian is a time portal. If the Romulans discovered that secret, they could use it to go back in time and change Federation or Earth history, leaving all of us to vanish like soap bubbles."
The captain straightened with a sudden air of decision.
"Bob wants me to call for backup and wait for a squadron, but there's no time for that. We're going in now." Kirk flicked on the intercom. "Mr. Scott."
"Aye, Captain."
"Prepare your engines for Warp 8, Scotty."
"Warp 8, Captain, but—"
The chief engineer took a deep breath.
"Aye, Captain."
The captain flicked another switch. "Lieutenant Uhura, encode a subspace message, Priority 1, for Admiral Comac. Include the message I just received and inform him that we are responding immediately. Tell him we need full backup ASAP. Lieutenant Sulu, assign Ensign Chekhov to plot a course for Sector 90.4, Warp 8. He glanced back at McCoy. "Bones, I've got a hunch we're not going to get out of this one without fighting." Czar was confused and excited when he left sickbay. Dr. McCoy and his staff were too busy to visit. Apparently, the Enterprise would soon be coming out of warp drive and trying to stop an enemy invasion. When he reached his small cabin, the youth absently began sketching a picture of the Guardian of Forever, as he had seen it when he and the 3 officers had come back from Sarpedon's past. If the Romulans gain access to the time portal, Czar thought, with a stab of fear, all our lives would be forfeit. If only there was something I could do to help. He flung the sketchbook down, then picked up a data cassette on Sarpedon's history, the same one Spock had used to trace him. It would have been better if he had never come back for me, he thought sadly. Then I could have at least kept my illusions intact about my father. Czar fed the cassette into the computer link, absently scanning the archaeological reports on his world's history 5,000 years in the past. I was the only person alive in that entire northern continent, he realized. Even more isolated than I ever suspected. Those archaeologists never did figure out where my cave paintings came from, did they? Absently, the youth began scanning a report about the civilizations in the southern continent that had been emerging at approximately the same time as he'd been a solitary hunter in the north. There was a real cultural awakening happening down there, he thought. Technology altering from bronze to iron and steel. Abstract concepts like the zero, they all started in this little valley, the Lacreo Valley, in a city called New Arian. Text and pictures scrolled past him as he idly watched and read. Suddenly, Czar's fingers stabbed the pause control, and he stared at one particular image, his eyes wide. No, he thought incredulously. That can't be. There must be some mistake. The caption beneath the picture caught his eye. A frieze from a palace wall in New Arian, believed to have some esoteric religious significance. Numbly, Czar turned off the computer and sat staring at his sketch of the Guardian of Forever, his thoughts racing. When the Enterprise entered Gateway Sector, Kirk found the Lexington still occupied in a futile search for the vanished Romulan vessels. But both starship commanders soon discovered that they had more to worry about. Starfleet intelligence reported that an entire Romulan fleet had crossed the neutral zone and was now heading straight for them. All contact with the 12 Federation archaeologists stationed on Gateway had been lost, and Spock reported picking up strange sensor readings from the planet's surface, as though their probes were somehow being reflected back at them. Kirk decided to beam down to Gateway himself. With a party from security, plus Spock and McCoy, the captain mounted the transporter platform. But just as Scotty prepared to energize, Zar staggered into the room, his face drawn and pale. Dr. McCoy jumped down from the transporter pad and caught his arm. "Zar, what's wrong?" "The archaeologists. They're all dead, Captain. I saw them just now." Kirk stared at him skeptically. "How do you know that, Zar? How could you see them?" "I don't know how. I saw them in my mind somehow. They've been killed, tortured, all of them." He shook his head numbly. The captain motioned Spock to the side. "Precognition?" he guessed. Spock nodded. "Apparently. Zar's Esper abilities are much greater than mine, and even I was able to sense the deaths of the crew of the Intrepid, parsecs away in space." "I remember that." Kirk beckoned the youth over to join them. "Zar, I'd like you to come along with the landing party, if you will." Zar nodded eagerly, then at Kirk's direction, left to change into scouting clothes. Spock turned to Kirk in protest. "Captain, Zar is a civilian. We cannot take him with the landing party." The captain gave his first officer a grave look. "We're in a lot of trouble on this one, and Zar's abilities could be useful. God knows I'm going to need all the help I can get." He rubbed his jaw nervously. "Spock, if Bob and I can't ensure the Guardian's safety before that Romulan fleet arrives, then we'll have to destroy Gateway and the Guardian rather than let it fall into enemy hands." The Vulcan considered. "Perhaps a force field, Jim. We could surround the Guardian with one." "Good idea. Go get a unit and bring it with you." Minutes later, both Zar and Spock were back in the transporter room. The younger man was carrying the leather backpack he'd brought from Sarpedon's past under one arm. The captain nodded at his chief engineer. "The Romulan fleet's ETA is 6 hours, Mr. Scott. Until I return, you're in command." "Aye, Captain. We'll keep a sharp watch out for those ships." Kirk nodded. "Energize, Scotty." Zar was correct. There were no survivors. While the doctor and the security team handled the unpleasant task of identifying the bodies of the archaeologists amid the burning ruins of their camp, Kirk beckoned to Zar and Spock. The three walked away from the carnage, until the captain, looking at the tricorder he carried, raised a hand to halt them. "The Guardian should be about 50 meters in front of us." Slowly he looked up. Only the endless ruins met his gaze. The massive time portal was gone. The Vulcan verified their location on his own tricorder. "Since we know that the Romulans already have the technology to create effective cloaking devices, I would speculate that they have managed to adapt one for planetary use. Captain, with your permission, I will attempt to reach the time portal and activate the force field unit." Kirk considered, then nodded. "Permission granted, Mr. Spock, provided you take Zar with you to warn you of Romulan patrols." "Out of the question, Jim. I will go alone." "No, Spock. With Zar's Esper abilities to pick up the location of Romulan patrols, you stand a chance of remaining undetected. Alone, they're bound to catch you. Out of the question. I forbid it." Zar's lip curled. "You're a little late to start giving me orders, sir. May I respectfully suggest that you mind your own business?" Spock's glance was startled, then his eyes narrowed ominously. Kirk hastily intervened. Look, you two go together or nobody goes. And Bob Wesley and I start carving Gateway up like a holiday roaster. What about it? Spock hesitated, then nodded, and after a moment his son echoed him. Tsar hefted his leather backpack. I'll go cache this in the ruins of the camp. Kirk sighed. I wish there were some other way, Spock. But this shouldn't take long at all. Now, don't forget, in exactly 5 hours, Bob and I will direct our phasers on Gateway. So you've got to be back by then, you understand? Understood, Captain. Spock hesitated. Tsar appears different lately, he ventured finally. Angry and, aggressive. It's not easy for him either, you know. I don't think I'd like to be labeled as Cranath. Spock stiffened and stared intently at Kirk. Where did you hear that word? Tsar. He said it meant shamed one, or bastard. The first officer's face was an alien mask carved from stone. Tsar does not understand the semantic content. Nor do you, Jim. Then maybe you'd better explain to him what it really means, Spock. Minutes later, Tsar and his father were picking their way around fallen columns and boulders. Once inside the cloaking device perimeter, they crouched, hidden in a half-cave formed by a fallen column, while Tsar concentrated, trying to empathically sense the presence of any Romulans. Finally, he gestured to the Vulcan to follow him. Spock found himself hard-pressed to keep up as they dodged from outcrop to outcrop, wiggling prone much of the time. They were well camouflaged, smeared with ashy dust by the time Tsar halted. He put a finger to his lips, pointing. The Guardian of Forever lay dead ahead. Tsar lay beside his father, peering out at the ancient time portal with a sinking heart. A small spacecraft lay just beyond the monolith, and several Romulans were unloading supplies from it. Spock motioned, and they scuttled back into hiding a safe distance away. Without warning, Spock broke the silence. There is something I must explain to you, Tsar. The meaning of the word Cranath. Spock took a deep breath. On Earth in the past, humans illogically placed the blame for illegitimacy on any resulting children. On Vulcan, it is different. The Cranath are regarded as having been shamed by the actions of their parents. Spock finally met Tsar's eyes directly. Cranath are given full status in both families. It is the parents, not the offspring, who have shamed themselves. I see. Tsar hesitated, hardly able to believe that they were having this conversation. So you would be admitting to a serious breach of custom if you were to acknowledge me? I have already done so. I filed a statement for Vulcan citizenship for you the day we returned from Sarpedon. Spock's dark gaze was unwavering. If anything were to happen to me, Jim has been directed to take you to Vulcan. There, T'Pau will grant you your rightful place in the family, in addition to what is yours under the provisions of my estate. Tsar searched for words, feeling awkward. Thank you for telling me. It's good to discover that I have a place to go. Not just a place. A home, Spock corrected. Tsar thought about the archaeological file he'd been reviewing and felt his stomach tighten. Where is my true home? What should I do? I'll have to make up my mind, and soon, he thought uneasily. Several minutes later, Spock looked up when he felt Tsar nudge his arm. The Romulans were gone. Quickly, the science officer began setting up the force field unit, while Tsar stood guard before the time portal, listening both mentally and physically. The Vulcan worked quickly, and he was almost finished when Tsar suddenly spoke up. Someone's coming! More than one! We've got to get out of here! Working feverishly, they concealed the force field unit under a pile of rocks, then dived for their hiding place, barely making it in time. Huddling shoulder to shoulder in the cramped niche, they waited for the Romulans to leave. But they did not. Time passed at a crawl as they waited and waited. Eventually Tsar fell into a half-doze since they dared not talk. When he awakened, he raised his head from his knees and glanced over at Spock, who was leaning wearily against the stone. How long? His father did not need to ask what he meant. 44.2 minutes until the captain begins the destruction pattern. Tsar glanced up at the shuttle. 1 sentry is still there. We can't wait any longer, can we? The Vulcan shook his head. No, we must leave now if we are to escape Gateway in time. As Spock vainly considered, then discarded alternatives for overcoming the guard, Tsar suddenly huddled back into a space in the rocks. He began breathing quickly, panting. The Vulcan stared at him, puzzled. "Tsar, what are you doing? Tsar!" His son ignored him as he breathed faster. His eyes were glazed and sweat beaded his upper lip. "I'm afraid we're going to die here. Fear. I'm afraid." Is he having some kind of breakdown, Spock wondered, completely bewildered. He put a hand on his son's shoulder, shook it gently. "Stop it. Control yourself. Shut up." Tsar shook off his father's hand and began again. "I'm afraid. He's killing me. Fear. I don't want to die." His eyes opened so widely that Spock could see the whites all around them as he fixed his gaze on the Romulan guard. Fear. His body stiffened, then went limp. Tsar tumbled over bonelessly and lay unmoving. Shocked, Spock stared at him, then in reflex glanced at the guard. The Romulan was also sprawled motionless in the dust. Is Tsar dead? Spock wondered, feeling a stab of fear and horror. Nightmare slow, he scrambled over to check Tsar's pulse and respiration. He was not breathing, and his pulse fluttered weakly. Quickly, the Vulcan pulled his son's head back, securing an open airway, then began artificial resuscitation. As he did so, Spock summoned his mental resources and began calling telepathically. "Tsar!" Spock's mental voice rose to the equivalent of a shout. "Tsar!" Finally, he felt a flicker of awareness. "Tsar!" His son gasped sharply, then began breathing again. Spock kept his fingers against the side of the youth's face, monitoring his physical and mental condition. Moments later, Tsar's eyes opened. "Quiet," Spock ordered. "Don't try to move yet, son." Tsar's gray eyes were clouded and confused, and he did not respond to what his father had called him. "What happened?" "You incapacitated the guard in some manner. We must move quietly. We haven't much time left." Spock draped his son's arm over his neck, fitted his shoulder beneath Tsar's arm, then heaved. "Good. That's it. Come on." Weaving drunkenly, Tsar was on his feet. He stumbled forward, leaning on the Vulcan. As they staggered past the guard, Spock glanced down and saw that the Romulan was quite dead. They had barely 5 minutes remaining on Kirk's countdown. Spock realized dully that they weren't going to make it in time. James T. Kirk paced anxiously amid the ruins of the archaeologist's burned and gutted camp, pausing every few minutes to scan the ruins with his distance lenses. Spock, he thought, feeling a tight knot of grief invade his chest. Where are you? What happened to you? He discovered that he could not allow himself to even think the word dead. 60 more seconds, he thought, glancing at his chronometer again. That's a full minute past the deadline. I owe Spock that. He wished desperately that he could mount a full-scale search for his friend, but duty must come first. Spock would understand that. Kirk knew he would. Jim thought about the Vulcan, remembering incidents from the past. Spock, raising that damned eyebrow across a chessboard, hanging upside down in that tree, grinning like a madman, his bearded alter ego from the mirror dimension proving that he was indeed a man of honor in 2 universes. Spock, staggering toward him, smeared with ashy dust. Kirk's eyes widened incredulously. Dropping his communicator, he began to run. Spock! The captain returned to pick up his communicator, which was signaling frantically. I found them. 3 to beam up.
Captain, I'm sorry, sir, but I cannot do as you ask. We've got 10 Romulan warships out here coming fast. We cannot drop our shields to use the transporter, sir.
I understand. You and Commodore Wesley will have to try and hold them off. Good luck, Mr. Scott.
Aye, sir. I'll signal you as soon as I can, Captain.
Kirk looked at his 2 companions with weary resignation. Damn, my ship up there fighting, and I'm not with her. Spock gave his captain a sympathetic glance as he handed Tsar the food and water packets Kirk had provided. Jim, since we cannot help the Enterprise, I believe we should attempt to go back and activate the force field unit. Kirk frowned. But if the Romulans have found the body of that guard you told me about, they'll be alerted it'll be suicide. If the Romulans discover the Guardian, our lives will be forfeit anyway, Spock pointed out reasonably. Kirk suddenly grinned, his old, reckless, give-'em-hell grin. You're right, Mr. Spock. Care to compute the odds against us? The Vulcan's dark eyes held a sudden glint of humor. This time, Captain, the odds against us are a mere 3,579.045 to 1. Well, that's certainly reassuring. For a moment there, I thought we were in real trouble. Tsar levered himself up off the boulder he'd been sitting on and spoke up for the first time. He's making that figure up, Captain. With 3 phasers, the odds against us are only... The young man broke off, his eyes rolling back in his head as he slumped into unconsciousness. Spock released his grip from the junction of his son's neck and shoulder, then caught him as he fell, scooping him up easily as though he were a child. Kirk nodded understandingly. You know you're raising those odds, Mr. Spock. The Vulcan glanced down at the unconscious face that was so like his own, his expression unreadable. No, Jim, I calculated them this way from the beginning. The Enterprise was taking a beating. The 7 remaining Romulan ships surrounded and harried her, jackals against a wounded tigress, taking care to stay out of range of her claws and fangs. Lieutenant Commander Montgomery Scott shifted uneasily in the command seat. He didn't like sitting here, never had. It was his duty, and he did it very well, but his first love was for his ship. It was almost physical pain to him to feel her engine straining, hear the damage reports flooding in. The Enterprise shuddered suddenly under the impact of a direct hit. Her artificial gravity field flickered, and for a brief second, her crew caught desperately at their consoles to avoid being thrown around. Then the ship steadied again. Lieutenant Sulu sounded grim. We cannot take another hit on our port deflector, sir. The Haggis is in the fire for sure now, since our starboard deflectors are already gone, Scotty thought, and considered his next move. Moments later, he straightened, his strategy clear in his mind. Lieutenant Sulu, arm all photon torpedoes and begin tracking those Romulan vessels. Shut down the power in the forward phaser bank to half capacity. Shut it down altogether on the port banks. And when they scan us, they'll think their hit caused an overload. At least, Scotty added silently, that's what I hope they'll think. The Romulans were circling again, but like jackals when the prey begins to stagger, they hadn't withdrawn as far this time. Photon torpedoes armed and tracking, sir. Aye, laddie. Now we wait. Right now they're wondering just how bad they hurt us. We'll give them their answer in a moment. The Romulan ships drifted closer, closer. Range, Mr. Sulu. 35,000 kilometers, sir. Hold your fire, lad. Range 29,000 kilometers, sir. Hold on, Mr. Sulu. Hold on. Scott shut his eyes, silently counting to 3. Now,
Fire, Mr. Shulu! The helmsman's hand flashed across his weapons console. The Enterprise quivered slightly as each bank of torpedoes launched. Nobody breathed. Suddenly, the main view screen was illuminated by a brilliant white light. Scott turned to Chekhov, who was manning the sensors. Status, lad. We got one, sir. And the Lexicon got another. I think maybe we scored a second hit, but I don't scan much damage on that ship. The chief engineer slumped back, watching the 4 remaining enemy ships wearily. It is not going to be enough, he thought. It's still 4 against 2, and we're hurt. He fancied that he could hear his ship panting from exhaustion and wounds, and silently apologized to the Enterprise. It was a good try, lass, but... Lieutenant Uhura suddenly turned to him. Mr. Scott, we're being hailed, sir. It's Admiral Comac. Ensign Chekhov was gesturing wildly at his sensors. Ships, Mr. Scott. 5 Starfleet vessels just entering this sector. When Tsar first awoke in the ruins of the archaeologist's camp, he was furious to find that Spock had left him behind. He sat up stiffly, seeing the communicator carefully placed beside him, and pushed aside the scorched blanket that had kept him warm while he slept. Why didn't he take me with him, he wondered angrily. He left me behind just as he left my mother. Damn him! But just as Tsar reached a fever pitch of rage, Kirk's words suddenly echoed in his mind. He does care, Tsar. He risked his life. More, he let Bones and me risk ours. He wanted to keep me safe, Tsar realized, his breath catching in his throat at this sudden insight. He knew he could only leave one of us behind, and he chose to protect me. Jim Kirk isn't here. I am. He felt a strange, sad pride. My father does care about me. I know that now. Now that it may be too late. Tsar caught his breath as a quick image flashed across his mind's eye. A darkened tent holding 2 bound figures with bruised, blood-streaked faces. Oh no! They've been captured! The Romulans are going to torture and kill them, just as they did the archaeologists. Tsar picked up the communicator and checked that he still had his phaser. His mouth tightened grimly as he turned to pick his way out of the rubble. He stood for a moment, the breeze tugging at his thick, slightly curling hair. His gray eyes narrowed as he extended his empathic perception, sensing the positions of the Romulan sentries. It's not too late. I won't let it be, he resolved. Then he set off at an easy, ground-covering lope, heading straight for the cloaking device perimeter.
I lay on the rock floor, feeling the cold seep upward into my body. In one way, it is a blessing, for it numbs the pain of my twisted arms and legs, of bonds pulled too tight, the gag that makes it agony to breathe. In another way, the cold itself is torture for me. I feel perpetually chilled in temperatures humans regard as comfortable. How much time has passed since James Kirk and I were captured, beaten, bound hand and foot, and thrown brutally into this tent to await our promised execution. Fatigue has dulled my time sense, but I concentrate and the answer emerges. 1 hour and 14 minutes exactly since the Romulans had dragged us out of our hiding place. At least I was able to activate the force field unit. The Guardian is safe. I wish I could have left Jim behind in the ruins too. As I listened to the captain's pain-filled breathing, I realized that he is still unconscious. The Romulans have beaten him cruelly, and 3 burly Centurions held me helpless, forcing me to watch. How many minutes until our deaths? I have no personal fear of death. It is simply a cessation of biological existence, with either something or nothing following. But the thought of having to witness James Kirk's death is a pain that no mind control technique can block. Where is Tsar? By now, he should have awakened, contacted the ship, assuming the Enterprise has not been destroyed in battle. If Tsar has contacted the ship, perhaps help is on the way. But logically, I must acknowledge that there is small chance of that. Nobody will know we have been captured until it is too late. Nobody will know for hours that we are dead. No. One person will know of our deaths. I am certain of it. My son will know, because there is a link between us. In my final moments, I can accept what has happened, accept the results of my actions on Sarpedon, and even feel pride that when I am gone, a part of me will continue to live. One metal, one family, one life, forged in mind and body, tempered in blood and spirit. The ancient Vulcan phrase runs through my mind. Then, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. My son will know when I die, and it will cause him pain. I regret that Tsar will be a helpless observer to his father's demise. I hope the Romulans will be quick, for both our sakes.
Spock awoke from a pain-racked doze to the sound of a nearby explosion. The ground beneath him quivered, then shook. The Vulcan lay listening to the pound of running feet and cries of alarm from the Romulans. Beside him, James Kirk roused slightly, moaning a little from the pain of his injured ribs. 10 minutes later, Spock's sensitive hearing picked up another noise, the sounds of Starfleet issue phasers. Moments later, a squad of Federation Marines burst into the tent. Spock heard Leonard McCoy's welcome tones, demanding to know whether he was all right. On Admiral Comac's orders, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy went back to the Guardian to guard it against any Romulan intrusion. Kirk moved slowly, nursing his bandaged ribs, but McCoy, after a hasty examination, assured the captain that he would be fine after a few days' rest. As they walked, the doctor filled them in on what had happened. "It was Tsar." The doctor gave Spock a sidelong glance. "He used his communicator to tell Uhura that in precisely 1 minute the cloaking device would be gone, and that we should be ready to transport down. He even told us which tent you were in." "And the explosion?" Kirk asked. "He must have set his phaser to overload," Spock concluded. "From the magnitude of the blast, Tsar planted it directly beneath the Romulan shuttle housing the cloaking device." Leonard McCoy nodded. "You got a smart kid there, Spock. You got to admit that." The Vulcan raised an eyebrow, and the faintest of smiles touched his mouth. "I have never attempted to deny it, Doctor. Heredity, as a factor in determining intelligence, is a well-established scientific fact." Kirk grinned despite the pain of his bruised ribs. "And to think that you were worried that he might get hurt. I wonder if we can talk him into joining Starfleet." Just as the three officers reached the Guardian of Forever, Tsar stepped into view. His laced leather tunic was tight now, and so were the leather breeches tucked into his furred moccasins. Only the gray fur cloak fit the same as it had 7 weeks ago. Spock stopped dead, immediately realizing the implications of Tsar's clothing. The Vulcan took a deep, painful breath. "You are going back to Sarpedon?" Tsar nodded. "I have to go back. If I don't, I'll change history. There's no telling what harm that will do to the space-time continuum. We've all risked our lives today to protect the time stream, so I can't stay, even though I wish I could."
Dr. McCoy shook his head. But Tsar, what makes you think you'll change history if you don't go back? Living in that Arctic wilderness alone? Tsar smiled. I'm not returning to the northern continent, Leonard. I'm going south to the La Creo Valley. I won't be alone. Kirk blinked. The La Creo Valley 5,000 years ago? Why there? Tsar drew himself up proudly. Ask my father. I can tell that he remembers. The Vulcan nodded. The La Creo Valley was Sarpedon's equivalent of the Tigris-Euphrates civilization on Earth, a significant cultural awakening. The first development of written language, abstract concepts such as the zero, smelting iron and steel instead of bronze, as well as many other advances. Tsar looked at his father. I now know why they developed so fast. They had help, and I provided that help. Earlier today, I discovered evidence that I couldn't ignore. Evidence that tells me I have to go back, or there may never be any advanced culture for my people. Kirk nodded slowly. I see what you mean, but Tsar, this decision is final, you know. There's no guardian on the other side. Are you sure? I'm sure, Jim. Kirk stepped forward to shake the younger man's hand. Okay, then. I admire you for what you're doing, Tsar. I wish you the best. Leonard McCoy nodded. Me too, Tsar. Going to miss you. A lot. I'll miss you, too. Tsar's gaze stopped on his father's face. All of you. Goodbye. He squared his shoulders, then walked toward the Guardian. Spock hesitated, then stepped forward. Tsar, wait, please. I recognize that you have made a difficult decision, and I am proud of you. But before you leave, there is something you must know. He stretched out his hand, then touched his son's temple lightly, closing his eyes in concentration. There was silence, except for the wind, for many heartbeats. Finally, Spock dropped his hand and stepped back. Tsar's eyes opened, and they were shining with triumph and joy. The meld! The truth! He took a deep breath. Jim was right. You did care for her. Spock nodded. Yes. She was all the warmth in that frozen world. Tsar walked over to the Guardian, placed one hand on the portal's rocky surface, and closed his eyes. Instead of the usual vapor and swirling images, one picture appeared, sharp and vivid. Mountains towered in the distance, and sapphire rivers ran through aqua meadows. Beta Niobe blazed red, and they could smell the warm summer breeze. A village of wood and mud huts huddled in the far distance. Tsar looked at them all one final time. Peace and long life. Slowly, formally, he gave Spock the Vulcan salute. Father, I leave you my paintings, past and future, as a symbol. Then he gathered up his heavy pack and leaped with a hunter's feline grace through the portal. They watched him land, saw him pull off his cloak and shake his head in the warm breeze, smiling happily. He did not look back. The Vulcan stood quietly watching as his son's image flickered, then winked out. Tsar was gone.
Once again, I'm alone in my cabin staring at an image on my computer screen. A stack of paintings leans against the wall behind me. Paintings done in a bold, primitive, yet arresting style, bright with color and life, as is the painting before me on the computer screen. A voice not unlike my own echoes in my mind. Father, I leave you my paintings, past and future, as a symbol. Here it is. I experience a surge of quite un-Vulcan triumph and relief. This is the symbol he promised me, a message to tell me that he made it, that he was safe, that he remembered his promise. He knew I would look for it in Sarpedon's archaeological records. Against the black background, stars flicker vividly. Stars as they appear from space, minuscule spheres in myriad colors, unwinking and still brilliant, though these stars were painted 5,000 years ago. Stars. And the familiar shape of the Enterprise, sleek and shining, caught in her passage between the stars. And beneath it all, a hand, open-palmed, the fingers spanning time and distance in the Vulcan salute.
Yesterday's Sun, written and abridged by A.C. Crispin, read by James Doohan with Leonard Nimoy as the voice of Spock. Mix engineering and sound design by Steven Erickson, with additional sound effects by Gary Fink. The recording engineer was David Knight. Original music was created by Sam McCallie. Additional music by Carl Schurtz. Yesterday's Sun was produced and directed by Karen Frillman, with production assistance from Linda Ross. Yesterday's Sun is a Simon & Schuster AudioWorks work. If you enjoyed this exciting Star Trek audio, then you'll be thrilled by the more than 37 Star Trek novels and invaluable guidebooks available from Pocket Inspiration.